This is our introduction to expressions. So an expression is a mathematical phrase. Kind of like we have phrases and sentences in language arts, well, we have them in math as well. And an expression would be something that is like a phrase in language arts, which is a little different than an equation, which would be like in language arts an actual complete sentence. So there are some slightly different variations of expressions, and the ones that we're going to be working with are actually algebraic expressions. And what makes something an algebraic expression is that it has to have at least one number and one operation symbol and a variable. As long as you have something that has all three of those things, you have an algebraic expression. And what we're going to be doing first with expressions is what we call evaluating. Now, evaluating is basically a fancy math word for simplifying. When you are evaluating in an expression, what you're going to do is you're going to first replace any variables. So you're first going to replace any variables with a numerical value. So you're going to swap the variables for numbers. Because once you then have numbers anywhere that used to be a variable, now then you can do the second step, which is simplify. And when we simplify, we're going to go back to using something that you learned in an earlier grade called order of operations. So evaluating expressions sounds kind of fancy, but really it's a two-step thing. So what are those two steps again? We're going to first replace variables. I'm going to color code. I like colors. So step one is to replace variables with numbers. And then step two is simplify. And we simplify by following the order of operations. Now, let's take a side trip here for just a second and remind everybody, what are the order of operations? What does that mean? Well, what it means is that you're going to go in a certain order if there's more than one thing that needs to be done, more than one operation. And the order of how you do those operations, you may have learned an acronym. Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally. And that's a great acronym to help you remember basically the order, but there are a couple of things to keep in mind. P stands for parentheses. If you have any parentheses or grouping symbols, they don't have to be specifically parentheses, they could be brackets. You're going to work with those first and get those resolved and simplified. Then you would attack any or simplify anything that's got an exponent. You would actually work out what that exponent value would be. Then the third thing, at that point you shouldn't have any parentheses or any exponents. Everything should be multiplying, dividing, adding, and subtracting. And of those, multiplying and dividing are actually the same operation. They're just kind of the forwards and backwards of each other. So you really are going to do those in order that they would appear in the expression from the left to the right. So you would go from left to right doing multiplying and dividing, which may mean doing dividing before multiplying. That's something that sometimes people get confused. Then the final step would be to do adding and subtracting. Now again, adding and subtracting, kind of like multiplying and dividing, are really the same thing, just going forwards and backwards. So they also are something that you do from the left to the right, which again might mean subtracting gets done before adding. It's just whatever order it would come in from the left to the right. So now let's see how this would actually look in an example or two. So remember, our two steps are to replace, and then simplify. Replace the variables with numbers and then simplify. For all three of these examples, we're going to use 3 anywhere we see an m, -2 anywhere we see the variable p, and +2 anywhere we see the variable r. So the first step would be to rewrite each of these. We'll do them one at a time, but to rewrite it, and anywhere we see any of these, we're going to swap out and replace them with those numbers. So for this first one, keep in mind that a fraction bar is another way of grouping and saying that everything on the top gets done, and then we do anything that would be on the bottom. In this case, there's only one number, so there's not things to do. But once we get this down to a single number, we're going to actually divide this number by this number. So let's start out with our replacing. So we have -4 right next to an m. A number next to a variable, remember, means to multiply. So I'm going to just put these in little parentheses next to each other. So remember that that means multiply. Plus 3p, that would mean 3 times whatever p is. So 3 times -2, just following along with what it says each of those is. And then the r would be a 2, that's going to go on the bottom. Now I use my order of operations. I know I used parentheses, but these aren't really parentheses. There are no exponents. So the first things I need to do are any multiplying and dividing. Both of these are multiplying. So I'm going to start from the left. I have -4 times 3, that's -12. Plus 3 times -2, I can go ahead and do that. That would be -6 over 2. And then I'm going to simplify again by adding -12 plus -6. That's going to be -18 over 2. I have one last thing then to do. I'm going to divide -18 by 2, and that's going to give me -9 for my final answer on that first one. You try the next two on your own.